Today's automobiles are built for overall performance on the highway. You can make improvements to a Jeep, but you'll never have the all-around highway performance of a Mustang.
However, if a Jeep is in its element, it doesn't matter what's under the hood of a Mustang, it will never match the Jeep's off-road prowess.
New Jeeps are designed and built with versatility in mind. That compromise will have an effect on some of its road manners. Bottom line, a Jeep will never be a Mustang.
Jeep obviously did a whole bunch of research and a whole bunch of homework when they put this Jeep Wrangler JK together. It's a phenomenal vehicle out of the box. Unlike, it's way better than any of the Jeeps that Jeep sold before.
What gives the Jeep its versatility is the trail-rated suspension. And one of the key components to that suspension is the coil spring.
What type of spring rate did they use? What did they come to determine was the best type of spring for that vehicle?
So Brooke, what exactly do the coil springs on a Jeep do?
Well, Dennis, they hold up the Jeep.
Springs are for storing energy. They can absorb energy, they can store energy. You push it, it holds a force, you release it, and it gives back all of the energy that you put into the spring. This is why it works so good on vehicle suspensions. Nothing else has really lasted as long other than the wheel itself.
Okay, so what about the shocks? Some people think that shocks also help support the body.
They probably think that because it's so hard to compress a gas-charged shock. Shocks help smooth out the ride and isolate the driver from the chaos of the suspension. It's very similar to your marital problems, Dennis.
Well, I don't think that's really an appropriate comment. Besides, who says that my wife and I are having troubles
Shocks and
anyway?
springs are a delicate balance, and when properly paired, they bring bliss. Like Stills and Crofts, Simon and Garfunkel, Loggins and Messina, Hall and Oates, Elton John and Kinky D.
Maybe not Elton John and Kiki D. By the way, that's Kiki D.
Whatever.
But if you do make the wrong choice, we could wind up with Milli Vanilli.
And we don't want that.
When consumers look at what am I buying? What are the offerings that are out there? When I take all the coil spring manufacturers, everybody builds a pretty good product, for the most part of the good manufacturers, but how do I pair and pick the right parts to get the job done?
There are 4 basic coil spring choices available, and each one will hold up your Jeep. But the design of the spring can change the feel of your Jeep. At the risk of setting off every armchair quarterback and forum troll out there, let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of some of the spring designs without throwing down a bunch of engineering speak.
To gain a better understanding on how springs are made, we took a road trip to our spring manufacturer in Fresno, California, the home of Betts Spring.
We work with the experts at TeraFlex. They know what characteristics they want in the suspension. We design springs to deliver on those ideas.
They design and build just about every type of spring known to man. Their state-of-the-art facility is second to none, and they were gracious enough to share some of their expertise with us. It was refreshing to get some straightforward, impartial information.
Yes, it was. I then took that information and skewed it to fit my own personal needs.
Dennis, you don't tell him that. You feed it to him, subliminally.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what I was thinking. Yeah.
First off, let's talk about progressive springs.
A progressive spring gets progressively stiffer as you compress it.
The theory behind a progressive spring is to make a spring with a variable rate that will provide a soft trail ride, but be able to change rates and perform at a different rate with a heavy load, or while cornering on the road at speed.
For a progressive spring to work to its full potential, all 4 of the top coils need to be active. If the progressive section of the spring is stacked to what is called a coil bind, those coils are no longer an active part of the suspension.
That collapsed section of coils at the top of the spring will really just act like a spacer lift or even a block of metal if it stays completely compressed at normal driving. Now, there are springs sold as being progressive that are really just a good linear spring. Nothing wrong with them, but they do not and cannot do what they are promoted to do when the softer coil rates are all stacked up and a coil bind at ride height and during road driving.
Progressive springs do not necessarily give you the best ride. From ride height, as it goes down, it doesn't match the dampening of the shock absorbers. You'll get nice ride handling characteristics, but you'll get a sharp, harsh bump, kind of a kick over any kind of little bump, pothole, or anything that comes up on the road.
Progressive springs are a bit tricky. If a Jeep is loaded heavy, they'll settle into that higher or stiffer spring rate, which will easily carry the load. But if that same spring rate is used on a lighter Jeep, that kick or bump could be experienced as the softer rate coils stack or go to bind when you hit a bump, and the spring makes a transition to the heavier rate.
Some of them have complained about how harsh that lower coil is when it comes into play, the rate that's there. I look on their vehicle and I look, all their top coil springs are touching. What they're expecting, that they were supposed to get this nice soft ride for the first couple inches of travel, was gone because all the upper coil springs are touching and sitting on each other.
There is good news though. At full droop, the compressed coil will unwind and extend, holding the coil in place with constant pressure.
That is nice. Now hopefully that constant pressure of the coil spring pushing against the body isn't so much that it unloads and tries to push the body back onto its back. You know, like when you're trying to attempt to climb a steep obstacle. That's why the extreme boys use a suck-down winch to pull the front end down on a steep incline.
Next up is dual rate spring. They might be a little harder to spot.
This design can be a bit confusing because of its many names. It's often referred to as a dual rate, a variable rate, or even a multi-rate spring. This design has its benefits as well as some challenges.
They can have a tightly wound section at the top that's used to help keep the spring in place at droop, and it's usually not considered part of the active suspension. There is also a section in the center that is used for most driving conditions. Finally, there's a higher spring rate section at the bottom of the spring used to help control suspension bottoming.
As you compress this, one coil will go to coil bind, compress a little bit further, another coil will go to coil bind, and press a little bit further, and another coil will go to coil bind. This gives you a variable rate spring.
As with any spring, as long as all the coils are not stacked or bound, the spring rate is actually a combination of all the active spring rates combined. For example, a spring with a section at the top with a spring rate of, say, 100, and the next section with a rate of 185, followed by a heavier rate of, 250. Now, just because a spring is designed with several rates doesn't mean that we get to pick and choose which rate we'll experience. That is, until a section of that spring goes to coil bind. If the light rate section of the spring is all stacked together at ride height or even at normal driving conditions, that rate is really never experienced. The spring rate you experience will actually be a combination of the two heavier rates. 90% of the time, that's what you'll feel.
That's not necessarily what rides best or handles best, but some people like variable rate springs.
Can shock valving be complicated by a variable rate spring?
To me, again, it just doesn't make sense to put a coil spring on there that you have to find a shock that has this valve for 3 different rates that tries to figure out where I'm at with the vehicle that I pick, with the accessories I put on it.
With so many variables, it can be a difficult task.
Proof's in the pudding. There's no substitution for testing on a vehicle, making sure that the ride characteristics match the shock absorbers, match the other components of the vehicle suspension.
Make sure your shocks and springs are tuned to work in harmony with your Jeep. That combination is much more critical than any special or unique spring design. Now, properly set up, a dual rate spring should help eliminate some of that harsh bottoming and perform pretty much like a linear spring at ride height.
The way we like to do this is on Jeep springs is to have the coil bind occur deeper into the stroke, so that when you're going to this second higher rate, it's controlling the bottoming of the suspension so that you don't get that harsh bottoming. You still get a nice sweet spot with a linear rate from ride height, but you get the added cushion effect of the second rate.
The top set of coils are fully compressed at ride height and are not an active part of the suspension. They kind of act like a spacer lift. They only expand as the axle hangs down while flexing or climbing a steep obstacle. They do hold the spring in place with a constant pressure that's pushing the body away from the axle.
As the suspension compresses while hitting a washout in the road or landing a jump, the spring is compressed to coil bind on the first two spring rates.
When this happens, that heavier rate section at the bottom of the coil attempts to slow that axle up travel to prevent harsh bottoming. That's a good thing. But is the dual rate spring the magic bullet of all springs? Like everything else, it has its pros and cons. It fills the needs of a certain driver, but not all drivers. Consider how you'll be using your Jeep and then make your choice.
People they just want to have the best. They want to think their stuff's the best. They think it's the best. Whether someone tells them they're going to get this result out of a particular coil spring, whether it's completely false, they're going to believe it because they want to believe it.
If you truly want a progressive or a dual rate spring, a coilover kit is another option. Coilovers have a smaller footprint because the shock is actually built inside the spring. Coilovers can be a great solution for those willing to put in the time and money to do it right. Take the time to determine if this conversion would be right for you. Check on shock maintenance intervals and shock dimensions. Look for extended and collapse lengths, as well as travel.
A JK bolt-on coilover conversion may not even provide more flex. In fact, it may not give you a better ride. Too soft of a ride can be dangerous on the road, but feel great on the trail. It all depends on how they're set up. You need to take things like shock valving, spring rate, and the vehicle weight all into consideration when setting one up.
I fully believe springs are well overthought. And then, you bring up coilovers, there's a whole nother game to bring into it. I get people on there that coilovers are the only way to go. If you've got a good coil spring and a good shock, what's the difference? With a coilover, now all of a sudden you've got a coil spring slider, you've got coil spring isolators, you've got parts that can come loose, you've got parts that are bound to make noise.
Often we see less usable travel when coilover fitment is the only thing considered on install. There's some well-designed kits out there. Be careful with a mix and match one-off system. Coilovers rank high on that cool scale, but there's no magic involved in a coilover. They're simply an excellent shock with coil springs. Just like any suspension, set it up wrong, and you just spend a lot of money for nothing.
Wow, the proper combination between shock and spring seems to be really important.
You're darn tootin', Brooke. In fact, TeraFlex chooses the linear spring for many of the same reasons that original equipment manufacturers choose them on their vehicles.
Linear rate springs or straight rate springs are very simple, and it also aids the suspension people who are tuning shock absorbers.
It's easier to tune because it's fairly similar all the way through versus having one that who knows where you're going to be at.
Linear rate springs really give you the best ride for the first couple inches below your ride height of your vehicle.
A defined spring rate will assist in shock valving, resulting in a no-surprise ride in the first few inches of suspension travel used on the road or even light trail use. There are no sudden spring rate changes, which can cause inconsistency in ride and handling.
When we lift our Jeeps, we need to make changes to the spring rates to maintain the handling on the road as well as to provide a comfortable ride on the trail. At TeraFlex, we've spent considerable time in R&D and testing to achieve a superior highway ride, as well as to vastly improve the off-road experience. There's plenty of talk about this spring or that spring providing more flex, but how much does the spring itself really affect flex?
No unretained or freestanding spring will ever limit down travel, or flex as it's often referred to. Don't get caught up in the flex debate. All things being equal, a brand A 2.5-inch coil spring will have exactly the same flex as brand B's kit.
It's not the spring that helps or hinders the droop. It doesn't matter if it's a progressive, a linear, a dual rate, or an extreme double whammy rate. all springs are going to droop the same.
JK's down travel is, however, limited by plenty of other things. Things like driveline bind. Your stock sway bar link will need to be replaced so that flex isn't limited. The track bar and shocks will also have an effect on flex, and the list goes on. Make sure the lift you choose includes all the necessary components for increased flex and drivability.
When you come down to look at what's going to limit your articulation, it's your shock and your control arms. If your control arm geometry isn't going to allow an axle to fall or a wheel to fall without binding, if your track bar's binding, if any of those other components are binding, or your shock's limiting your down travel, you're not going to get the full function out of the coil spring that you have.
Up travel, on the other hand, or how far you can stuff that tire up into the wheel well, can be affected by the type of spring you use. A longer spring will obviously have more coils when compressed. Those coils will eventually reach coil bind. If the stacked length of the spring is too tall, the axle won't be able to continue to travel up, and the longer style spring will actually limit your up travel.
Usually tires and bump stops and just about everything else will hit before this happens. But the go fast through the whoops guys could experience a reduced up travel with a longer spring.
All right, so which spring is best? It's like asking which is better, a Mustang or a awesome JK pickup conversion with a 6.4 Hemi rolling on 38s. You chose a Jeep for a reason. The Jeep's versatility is attractive to all of us. Don't sacrifice that versatility trying to make it something it will never be. Is there one spring that's better than all the others? Absolutely not. TeraFlex is currently using linear rate springs with different spring rates for those loading their Jeeps up for overlanding, and a softer rate for those using their Jeeps for a weekend trail run as well as a commuter. Drive it to the trail and drive it home again.
By incorporating speed bumps with our springs, we are able to achieve a true dual rate effect. A consistent spring rate is easy to combine with a good shock and achieve an excellent ride.
But when you hit that washout at speed, the quiet, energy-absorbing power of that speed bump is unsurpassed. You can have the best of both worlds.
It drives great down the road, it works great in Moab. If you can take that same suspension out and win a 250-mile desert race and go take second place in open VA class on a Lucas Oil short course, the results speak for themselves. I mean, we're having phenomenal results with the setup that we're currently running now, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
It's all about compromise. You need to choose a spring that best suits your style of driving. And don't get caught up in the hype.
Thanks for watching.